Hello and welcome to the Career Compass program, which includes online learning sessions, podcasts, videos, webinars, white papers, and whiteboard videos, all specifically designed for NAVFAC. Please check the Career Compass Resource Center or CCRC often for updates and new content to support your learning. This content will assist with learning and development within the 20 non-technical competencies outlined in the Workforce Development Strategy. Today's topic is building an accountability framework in support of the accountability competency. Throughout this video, you will see a paper-pencil icon on some slides, indicating a workbook activity. When you see this icon on the top left corner, this means I'll be asking you to write something in your workbook or refer to your workbook. If possible, download the workbook from the Career Compass Resource Center or CCRC before continuing with this course. However, if you are not able to, just use any piece of paper and write your thoughts down on that. You can always transfer that to the workbook later. Upon completion of this course, you will be able to apply an accountability framework to your projects and be able to analyze the outcomes of that framework, and you'll be able to generate an accountability matrix as a practical tool to get the project done. For our agenda today, we'll talk about what is accountability, what is an accountability framework, and why and how do you use one. We'll talk about RACI, which is an acronym for a tool for team accountability, and we'll go through some more tips for team accountability, and specifically remote team accountability as well, in order to foster a culture of accountability. Before we go over a more formal definition of what accountability is, please take a moment to think about your current understanding of the term accountability. What do you think accountability means? Record your thoughts in your workbook. Pause the video and resume when you're ready. Accountability is the quality or state of being accountable, especially an obligation or willingness to accept responsibility or to account for one's actions. Is this the same as responsibility? Well, they are similar, but there is a difference. With responsibility, you have an obligation to act. With accountability, you have an obligation to answer for actions. That distinction is a bit nuanced. Let's talk about it a little bit more. When you're responsible for something, you may not necessarily be accountable. But when you're accountable, you're obligated to take responsibility. Let's go through an example to maybe make that a little more clear. A teacher may be responsible for teaching a student a math curriculum, but ultimately, the school administration is held accountable to whether the students can pass the standardized tests at the end of the year. So if students fail that standardized test at the end of the year, the math teacher probably isn't losing their job, but the school itself can lose funding and other resources. So here, the teacher is responsible, but the school system is accountable. Let's now talk about a real-life example that highlights the difference between responsibility and accountability. You may be aware of the infamous Tylenol poisoning that happened in the early 80s. Tragic as this situation was, it's a good example of a company exhibiting accountability. Odds are, even if you don't remember this incident, you've all experienced some frustration with trying to open a new bottle of over-the-counter medicine, trying to turn the cap, then dealing with the foil covering the top that's nearly impossible to remove, and then getting all that cotton out. It hasn't always been that way, and now it's tamper-proof for a good reason. Back in 1982, 7 people in the Chicago area died because someone tampered with the capsules in extra-strength Tylenol bottles. Someone had put potassium cyanide in the bottles, and then there were more copycat attacks throughout the country. The maker was Johnson & Johnson. Was Johnson & Johnson responsible for a criminal going out and killing people by lacing their product with cyanide? No. But they held themselves accountable. Even though when people started dying, it quickly became clear that the manufactured Tylenol product was not to blame, J&J issued a nationwide recall of 31 million bottles, which cost them about $100 million, which is more like $300 million when adjusted for inflation. They pulled their commercials off the air and stopped advertising. Within 6 weeks, they started producing tamper-proof bottles: the child-proof cap, plastic strip, foil seal, and cotton wad. We take that for granted now, but it was a big deal then. And in case you're wondering, no one was ever charged with the deaths of those people. Just a quick side note, we are not endorsing any of the companies mentioned today nor their products. So we've talked about what accountability is, so now I want you to think about yourself. What are you accountable for in your life? I want you to identify a project or team that you're accountable for, ideally at work, but you can draw from your personal life if you need to. Think about what is the project and what are some barriers you are currently encountering. Please record your thoughts in your workbook. Pause the video and resume when you're ready. Let's now talk about how maybe using an accountability framework can help you. We'll go through the steps of building a framework. As I'm talking through the steps, I want you to think about your situation and see if you can see how you could apply these steps to your project. If you weren't able to think of a specific project you are accountable for, that's okay too. But chances are, at some point in your career you will be, so it's good for you to learn these steps now as well. What is an accountability framework? It's a conceptual structure that outlines both the ownership and responsibilities to a project, as well as plans for achieving the initiative and measuring success. Being accountable for a project can be a huge undertaking and it may feel overwhelming. It may be helpful to get some structure. This is where using an accountability framework can be really useful. You may find that you already do some of the steps that we're going to talk about, but going through those steps in a predictable and methodical fashion gives you more support and guidance throughout the process. One specific type of accountability framework is called results-based accountability. This concept was coined by Mark Friedman in his book, Trying Hard is Not Good Enough. What does that mean? Well, it's really pretty intuitive. It's a 6-step process where you start with the end goal in mind and work your way backward, step by step. Here, you want to be very specific about what that end goal is. You've probably heard of SMART goals, where the S stands for specific. Your project needs to have a very clear objective. Results-based accountability works well because it moves you from talk to action quickly. It's a simple process that everyone can understand. It can help overcome assumptions that are barriers to innovation or getting the job done. It builds collaboration, consensus, and it is data-driven, so success is measurable. You can use results-based accountability as a roadmap. Use for any size project, small to global. Let's go over the steps that comprise this framework. We will go through each step in more detail a little later. The 6 steps are: 1. Define what is the result you're trying to achieve. 2. Determine how are you doing so far. 3. Determine why are you at the current status. 4. Determine who are the people who need to be involved in achieving the result. 5. Brainstorm what steps can be taken. And 6. Decide what do you propose. Just to give you an example of an organization that used this framework on a very global scale, let me tell you about McDonald's and what they did. Here's the background. McDonald's generates $21 billion in yearly revenue from 38,000 restaurants in over 100 countries and over 6 continents. They serve about 70 million people daily. They source a huge volume of agricultural commodities: beef, coffee, chicken, palm oil, and soy, to name a few. Because of that, McDonald's was significantly contributing to deforestation, which has other potentially disastrous cascading effects: soil erosion, water cycle disruption, greenhouse gas emissions, and biodiversity losses. McDonald's wanted to stop contributing to deforestation, so they worked with the World Wildlife Fund to develop an accountability framework in order to stop it. They developed policies and implementation systems for those supply chains. For example, in Brazil and Argentina, they use satellite imagery now to see if farmers are complying with these policies, and if not, those farms are suspended. By the end of 2020, 99.4% of the beef sourced for McDonald's restaurants supported deforestation-free supply chains, and 100% of soy sourced for the feed of chicken and palm oil supported deforestation-free supply chains. So they were able to achieve very significant results by putting a results-based accountability framework into place. Now, most likely what you're accountable for won't be on quite this grand of a scale, but it doesn't need to be this huge of a project for you to benefit from using the framework. So how do you put a results-based accountability framework in place at NAVFAC? Let's go over those 6 steps together. Step 1 is defining what results are you trying to achieve. Are you trying to create something from scratch? Are you improving something? For example, a program, process, or service? Identify exactly what you are focused on achieving. Then, select performance measures. Remember, I said this method is data-driven, so you want to find some performance metrics that you can use. And you want to measure quantity. In other words, how much did you do? Quality, how well did you do it? And impact, is anyone better off? Identify metrics around all 3 of those categories. Using an example of building runways at NAVFAC, as a qualitative measure, you could measure the percentage of planned runways that were actually completed in a given year. As a quantitative measure, you might measure technical specifications, such as runway dimensions or pavement roughness. Lastly, as a measure of impact, you might measure how many more flights are able to take off per year, thereby better supporting the warfighter. Step 2 is trying to determine how you are doing so far. If you're starting from scratch, then you may not have any data to inform this question, but very likely, the goal you're trying to achieve is something that's already been attempted previously or is in progress right now. This is where you want to gather any available data to try to determine where you are at in the process right now. If possible, you can even chart or graph it so that you have a bird's-eye view of the current status. Build a historic baseline, going back as far as possible. Now that you know where you are, you can move on to step 3, which is asking, why are you at the status you're at? List the factors that determine the current status of the project. This includes contributing factors that support progress, as well as what kind of things are actually inhibiting progress. Really brainstorm here. Don't just list the most obvious factors, but really try to go deeper into more of a root cause type of analysis. You may need to conduct additional research for this step. Once you feel like you've really summarized all the contributing factors for why you're at this status, you can then move on to step 4. In step 4, you're determining who are the people that need to be involved in this project. Hopefully, this shouldn't be too difficult at this point. If you know the root causes that were impacting progress, you can determine who would be instrumental here. You might not know specific names, but you would know the roles. On to step 5. Now that you know the factors that will influence the success of your goal and the people you need to help you with this, you can start to brainstorm the steps of how you will get there. It's important to really consider all the options. In this stage, any idea goes, no matter how silly or unfeasible it seems. Get your creative juices flowing. This can be a great team-building exercise. You can involve the team here to get their input. You've evaluated ideas for steps to be taken. Now, in step 6, you must decide, what do you propose? List the steps that you'll take to get to that goal you defined back in step 1. You've now come full circle. You may end up just modifying a strategy that's already in place, or you may end up scrapping the current strategy completely and starting the project back up in a different way. Make sure that your strategy addresses at least one, but hopefully a majority, of the root causes you identified in step 3. We've gone over the 6-step process for setting up a results-based accountability framework. Let's just talk for a minute about making sure we pay attention to a few things so we can set ourselves up for success. Here are some best practices. Make sure you clearly define expectations and roles for all involved parties. Have you ever been given a job or task with really vague or ambiguous guidance? It can be frustrating, right? When you're not given clear expectations and a well-defined task, it's hard to get the job done well. So start with that. Make sure you set clear and well-defined expectations. Make sure you can reasonably defend all your decisions in this process. Really think things through in advance and don't just throw spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks. The steps in this framework have to be realistic. Do you have the budget? The manpower? There may be a trade-off between the two. Don't just have people chasing their tails. Your plan must be intentional, rational, and informed by evidence. Be open to feedback. Even though you may be accountable and the buck stops with you, you should be open to criticism, feedback, and ideas. If someone comes to you with an idea or something that may not be working as you intended, take that to heart. This doesn't mean that 100% of the time you're going to act on it, but at least open yourself up to feedback and let the people on your team know that you welcome it. Accept responsibility. This one is kind of a no-brainer. Accountability obligates you to take responsibility. This means accountability not just for team members' performance on the task, but also for the overall outcome of the project. Lastly, seek continuous improvement. Again, makes sense, right? If you were just trying to keep the status quo, you wouldn't need this framework. So you should always be asking yourself, how can we make things better, more efficient, and more effective? Think outside the box and encourage your team to do so as well. Make sure the goals and all the steps in the framework are in line with the mission of NAVFAC. Now that you understand the steps of setting up an accountability framework, let's talk about a tool you can use within that framework to ensure project completion. This tool is called an accountability matrix, or more specifically, a RACI matrix. RACI is an acronym that we'll go over shortly. This matrix is a very simple yet effective tool where you outline all the tasks you've identified in Step 6 and assign them to the specific people you've identified in Step 4. So let's go through what RACI stands for. R stands for responsible. This is the person or people who will complete the task or process. A stands for accountable. This person is ultimately accountable for the task or process. C stands for consulted. These are the people that are consulted in order to be able to complete the job. They are often subject matter experts. I stands for informed. These are the people that need to be aware of the progress and/or receive output from the task or process. Let's take a few minutes to talk about how you would set up a chart like this and how to use it. If you'd like, there is actually a job aid with information and step-by-step instructions on the CCRC. If you go to the link provided on your screen, you'll see a tab for Job Aid, and if you click on that, you'll be able to download a fillable PDF. On this slide, you can see a theoretical project. This is just to give you an idea of what one could look like. What you would do is break down your project into individual tasks or steps and then assign the responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed parties for each task. These are the tasks and people that you've already identified in your 6-step process. Some things to keep in mind. You have to have at least one person responsible for each task or it won't get done. You can have more than one person responsible for a task, but only one person should be accountable, otherwise it's too easy to pass the buck. The same person can be responsible and accountable. Once you've completed the RACI matrix, make sure you share it with your team. Get their input to make sure all your assumptions were correct, and make adjustments as necessary. You also should share this with any stakeholders and incorporate any input they have. Just making this RACI will help move the project forward, but it's not something you should just set and forget. Use it. Refer back to it often and make sure everyone is staying on track. Treat it as a living document and update it on an ongoing basis as circumstances change. You know now how to design a framework and an accountability matrix. Let's also just go over some quick tips that you can use in general to keep your team accountable and to build a culture of accountability. The framework is great for specific projects, but you also want to nurture that kind of overall environment where people on the team are accountable. Some of these overlap a little with the framework, but they're things you can do outside of the framework as well. Again, set clear expectations. Maybe you pride yourself on not being a micromanager and giving an employee some freedom. That's great, but that doesn't mean they don't still need guidance. Always highlight the big picture. What is the why? When someone understands the bigger picture of why they are doing something, they will remain more engaged. Involve employees in the planning process. Ensure you have buy-in from the start, and then it's easier to hold people accountable since they had a say from the beginning. Make sure the entire team knows who is accountable for what. You don't want people duplicating efforts or saying, "Oh, I thought so-and-so was doing that." Give employees all the resources they need. This may be tough. Resources are sometimes scarce, but by resources, I don't just mean money. I also mean just letting people know where they can find what they need to complete the task. So, for example, if someone needs to make a nice Excel spreadsheet, make sure that they have been trained in how to use the software. Don't avoid confrontation. A large part of keeping your team accountable means you see when or where things are going off the rails and address that and rectify it. In the era of remote work, it's important to have some tips for how to keep a virtual team accountable. These tips also apply if you're a team member, not necessarily managing a team. Many of you are still working remotely or are working some kind of remote schedule. This can be very challenging, and it helps to do the following. Have daily or weekly check-ins with team members. There's a fine line between micromanaging and people feeling very isolated. Get to know your team members to find out what they need. Some may need daily check-ins, others may be fine with weekly check-ins. People working from home often don't know where to draw the line between personal and work time. Make sure that you encourage your team to set boundaries for themselves. Don't send an email at 8 p.m. and expect an answer. Leverage technology. Use collaboration software like Teams, FaceTime, or Zoom. Again, there may be some constraints here if you're on a government device, but really make an effort to use these tools when possible. Email and even phone calls are great tools for collaboration, but the human element sometimes gets lost when we don't see each other's facial expressions and nonverbal gestures. Share other people's successes with the whole team so they feel more connected. Lastly, you may want to consider some team building exercises to make everyone feel more connected. When they feel connected to each other and you, they are much more likely to stay motivated and accountable. You could do some formal remote team building, or it could just be something small like it going around at the beginning of a meeting and asking everyone a question, such as, "What's your favorite movie or TV show?" The benefits you reap by using the tips we just talked about are immense. Just to mention a few, deadlines will be met. Mistakes will be made but not repeated. There will be a higher quality work product. The team will be higher performing. And there will be a sense of trust within the team. This doesn't happen overnight. You really need to build that culture by using those accountability tools and tips you learned. We've covered a lot today. As we wrap up, I'd like you to take a moment and think about what are some things you learned today that you'll be able to apply to your position right away. Do you have a project that you can try implementing an accountability framework with? Or will you try some of the tips for remote accountability? Or maybe both? It doesn't have to be right now, but sometime in the next day or so, take some time to write down those thoughts in your workbook. Taking the time to think through how you will apply your learning and then writing it down will actually help you to stay accountable to yourself. Thank you for attending this webinar. If you have any questions, please contact your local BD17 representative or contact HQ's BD17 at NAVFAC-HQ, Total Force Development at Navy.mil. You will receive credit for participating in this course. To receive credit, email the address here with the listed subject line, course name, and completion code, or simply scan the QR code on your screen. This will automatically generate the email you need to send. Just be sure to include your Navy email address in the body of your email if you're using a personal device. Thank you, and have a great day.